Hello my loves and welcome to yet another episode of Strange Playgrounds, and apologies for the slightly mucal quality of this recording. As you may or may not know, here in the UK we are suffering an incredible heat wave at the moment, and the result of that, if you'll excuse me, is that there's a lot of pollen in the air, which is causing incredible degrees of hay fever and allergic reactions. So if I do start spluttering or sniffling or coughing during this, I do apologise. Those of you who've been paying attention to what's going on in internet horror circles lately will have no doubt noticed the recent video from the Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared channel. Now, for those who don't know, Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared is an internet project that is absolutely infamous. It's one of those internet projects that hit with the trauma, the cataclysmic trauma of an asteroid strike. It kind of changed the landscape of the way media is expressed and promulgated on platforms like YouTube. It's a very, very small project from about half a decade ago. It's a series of very, very short videos. I will link to the channel below, which emulates the format of children's television from around the 1970s, 1980s, but includes incredibly disturbing imagery, concepts, and themes which relate to how we market to children, how media responds to children in a capitalist society. In particular, it's a sort of criticism of how we utilize media to transform children into little consumers effectively. There's a lot of subtle storytelling in Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. In order to get the most out of it, you really do need to understand certain contexts. It is very aware of the conventions of children's television in the 1970s and 1980s. In particular, that kind of children's television which is designed to become a franchise or to market certain lessons to children. It is on the back of that, it is also about how older generations relate to younger generations. There is a very dark criticism at the heart of Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, which basically points the finger at older generations and basically says, you don't want us, and you never really wanted us, and all you really see in us is consumers. You see us as a means of making profit for yourselves, of turning us into participants in a culture that is inherently corrupt and that does not serve us on a psychological level or on a spiritual level or whatever. It's very dark, very disturbing, and a wonderful series. There's only 6 episodes, and they're only about 10 minutes each at the most. But it's well worth looking at. It's beautifully produced, really well put together, and is one of those beautiful pieces of obscure work on the internet that it sort of transgresses the boundaries of what we assume horror fiction and horror media to be. It markets itself as one thing and then very, very quickly reveals itself to be something other. In order to understand how it works, you have to be very much aware of the language and the nature of British children's television around the 1970s and 1980s. It echoes certain shows like, for example, Rainbow. Rainbow was a show that aired for a very long time in the UK, actually. I think from the late 1960s right through to the 1980s. I remember watching Rainbow when I was a kid, to the point whereby the puppets, Zippy and George, and the bear character Bungle, who was played by a man in a suit, are somewhat iconic. They're kind of indelibly burned into the minds of certain generations, i.e. my generation, here in the UK. And this show very much emulates the format of Rainbow. Again, you have 2 characters who are puppets, one that's actually a man in a suit. But it sort of... It's it's an exercise in dissection. It takes those shows and it slices them right down the middle, viciously peels back the multicolored layers and shows you the really dark beating hearts, the corrupt souls of these shows. It is a very cynical exercise in many respects, but that cynicism is part of what makes it work. It is absolutely stunning. It dares to say things like the moral lessons and the sort of guidance that these shows try to give to children are false and confused, and they are inherently corrupt. They are often designed to not only lie to children, but to distort our perceptions, to make us into nothing more than compliant little consumers and citizens who do as we're told and don't question authority. And if we do dare to step outside of those bounds, we're punished. In that regard, it also echoes the British children's show Thomas the Tank Engine. Thomas the Tank Engine, which again I loved when I was a kid, absolutely adored, and which is indelibly burned into the imaginations of certain generations of children in the UK and indeed beyond. But when you scratch the surface of Thomas in terms of its morality, it's a really dark show. There is this really unpleasant promulgation of conformity in Thomas. In Thomas the Tank Engine, the living trains of the island of Sodor are effectively indentured slaves, and their slave master is Sir Topham Hatt, the Fat Controller, a very stereotypical British industrialist and aristocrat in a sort of Victorian vein. There's a reinforcement of class distinctions in Thomas the Tank Engine. One of the greatest compliment the engines in Thomas the Tank Engine can get is you're a really useful engine, whereas they all live in fear, and I mean absolute stark terror of not being useful. They all live in terror of being sent to the junkyard or being left to rot in some train shed because they're not useful anymore. There is a darkness at the heart of these shows. There is an urge towards unquestioning conformity and authoritarianism that Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared just reveals. It, as I say, it slices them down the middle, peels back the multi-hued layers, the happy, clappy music and the visuals, and it shows you what's at the heart of these shows and how sinister and cynical it all is. Now, the transition of the show from the internet to a television channel is really interesting, because of course this kind of commentary technically can only be made on the internet. By being on the television itself, it becomes complicit in the medium. But I have enough faith in the creators for them to have acknowledged that and to understand that and to make that a part of the show. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they comment upon that transition itself, how they comment upon the transition from one medium to another, and how they retain that. I mean, another thing about the internet, about YouTube, and about crowd-funded projects like the original Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, is that they have creative space. There's no one leaning over their shoulder telling them it's got to be like this, it's got to be like that, you've got to do it like this. Whereas when you're operating on a television channel, the standards and the strictures are very different. As I say, the creators are so aware of this medium and so aware of the pressures and the forces acting upon any work they create, that I have no doubt that they'll have built that factor into the show itself. It's going to be very, very fascinating to see what comes of this. And at a time when authoritarianism and conformity are in such a swell in the UK and UK culture as well, where there are definite conflicts between forces of authority and anti-authoritarianism, I have no doubt that is going to be part and parcel of this show. The reason why a show like Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared can make its way onto what is effectively a mainstream television channel these days is because of those cultural tensions, because it reflects them and questions them. This is the time for those kinds of shows. And I honestly cannot wait. If you haven't seen Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, then I will leave a link below to the channel. Again, warnings, content warnings for this one. There's a lot of disturbing shit in this show. A lot of disturbing shit. And it comes because it occurs in the medium of a children's show. It emphasizes the disturbing nature of the imagery and of the concept, so be aware of that. Also, in order to get the best out of it, does require a little bit of historical and cultural context. Like, there's a shot at the very, very beginning of the very first episode that shows you a newspaper. And the date of the newspaper is sometime, I believe, in the 1950s. It's on the very day that a series of laws were passed in the UK that allowed advertising, commercial advertising, to occur within children's television. Now, the show doesn't mention that at all. It just shows you the image. The paper's name is The Right Wing, by the way, just to hammer it home. But you need to understand that context in order for that date to make sense, because that date recurs in the background throughout the entire show. If you don't know that, you won't learn that by watching the show. You've got to sort of go and research it for yourself. There's a lot of symbolic storytelling here, a lot of subtle symbolism, and it does require a little bit of work, a little bit of interpretation on the viewer's part to make sense. Otherwise, it is just a very, very weird, very disturbing internet project, which it can be appreciated on that level alone. The sense of incredible paranoia and creeping unpleasantness in this show is incredible. It's a work of sincerely postmodern horror. It doesn't conform to any of the formats or standards or prescriptions of what we assume horror is, and becomes its own very peculiarly disturbing work, and I appreciate it massively for that. Here's me, fingers crossed, sincerely hoping that when the television show airs, it retains a little of that essential deviant soul.